Florida economy. Our speaker, Matt DePaolis, is with us, and he'll be speaking in about 15 minutes. Before that, I would like to introduce our board and talk about a few other things. This educational event is part of the League's effort to influence public policy through education and advocacy, and to increase understanding of public policy issues, engage citizens in decisions that impact their lives, and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. For those of you who are on Zoom, we ask that during the presentations, you stay on mute and put your comments and questions in the chat. Following the presentations, we'll have opportunities for participant comments and questions. For those of you in the room, there are coffee, water, and snacks available. The snacks are over here on the table. The coffee and water are in the lobby area, compliments of the collaboratory. And we're looking forward to a very good program today. I would like to remind everyone that we actually have 3 meetings today. And especially for members, it's important that we're having the educational meeting immediately followed by the annual meeting. And we really need to have member participation in that, because we need to agree to our framework for the next year. We need to agree on the program, our budget, and our board members. So please stay for that meeting. It will go as quickly as possible, but we do need your participation. We can't have it without a quorum, and if we don't have the meeting, then we won't be able to move forward. So that's your incentive. Please stay and help us with that. Following the annual meeting, we will also have a very short board meeting in case anything comes up during this meeting. And then we will be starting our implementation next week at a board retreat, and all members are also invited to participate in that retreat. Now, a little bit about what the board is doing, and those of you who are members are well aware of this, but we do a number of things. One of them is voter registration information and preparing for the 2024 election. We'll be doing voter guides and candidate forums. Jerry Ware, who is our community outreach and voter registration board member, is unable to be here today due to some medical issues, but she wants me to ask all of you, are you registered to vote? So please raise your hand if you are registered to vote. If anyone is not registered to vote, we do have voter applications for you that you can submit to the supervisor of elections. You should also make sure that your registration is up to date. You can check that online. And to make sure that your vote by mail form is up to date. If you had one before, you still need to update it for this election. And related to our voter services activities, we are encouraging returning citizens, those are who are working on their rights restoration. The League has information and free pro bono legal assistance available to them, and our coordinator, Willie Middleton. Raise your hand, Willie. Do you want to speak at all? Okay, so Willie is coordinating our efforts on that, and one of the activities is to do postcarding, and if you'd like to assist with that, please let Willie know, Willie Middleton. And his information is shared with you through our emails. You can also write to the League email address, the Gmail, if you would like to do that, and we would appreciate your support on that. And we're promoting that information and the pro bono legal assistance at any community event that we can. So thank you, Willie, for that effort. The League is beginning our work on the voter guide and candidate forums for the primary and general elections. We welcome your recommendations for questions for both the voter guide and the candidate forums. So that is an offer for members as well as the general public. We want to know what you're interested in so we can ask the candidates. The next board member I would like to introduce is Dana Clark, who is our Director for Health, and she has some updates for you.
Well, I'm very delighted to tell you, I was a teacher, so I'm loud. Okay. If you don't know already, we were able to get on April 1st, okay, the ability to get the program or the amendment for choice on the ballot. And I'm coming from Pennsylvania, so we are all watching. The eyes of the nation are on Florida right now. What I'd like to tell you about is April 13th, 2 good days. April 13th, there will be a meeting in Orlando. And the meeting is sponsored by the Floridians for Freedom to vote. And it's going to be from 12 to 2 p.m. in Orlando. Also, April 20th, Super Saturday events. So all across the state, there will be events, both virtual and in person. For the Yes for Four partners will hold a teach-in, and it will be also virtual where we can learn how to talk to people, because it's a very, I guess, odd way of having to ask people, please vote for this, because they will say, well, are you voting for abortion? I really don't believe in abortion. So we have to really learn how to talk the talk for people. So I suggest read your emails. Okay, it's very important for those of us who have lived with the Roe versus Wade. My children, they thought that's the way that life was. So it's really important for the next month to read your emails, because you may not be able to go to Orlando and hold a sign, but you can go virtually, listen, learn how we can make this happen for the ballot in the fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. I'd like to introduce Eileen Conroy, who is our first vice president.
No, thank you for your attendance. My role is sending out communications to urge you to attend these events. So I was very successful today. Thank you.
And to sign up, if you're not already on our email distribution list, please sign up for that. And if you'd like to become a member, Amy Wolf, our membership director, is not here today. A lot of people had conflicts today, and it was really bad timing on our part, but we would like you to join us if you're not already a member and to work with us. You met our treasurer, Anna Caldwell, at the registration table, and she's still out there working. Our secretary, Stacia Arcarice, was unable to be here today. Betsy Vaughn is here. Betsy, did you want to, who's our director for education?
Welcome. It's so good to see so many people. I just have a few quick notes. We have a statewide education action team, and we meet via Zoom, and we went through, the team reviewed 68 education bills this year. We took a position on 26 of those, testified on 10, and out of all of those bills, 6 were passed and the rest died in committee. The good news is that 3 of the 6 that were passed. The not as good news, although there is a little bright spot in it, one of the things I know that I've been talking a lot about is the bill having to do with the employment and curfew of minors. And when that bill first came out, it was horrendous, and now it's just bad. Not, I mean, it's one of the commenters from the state said the good news was it wasn't as bad as it might have been for the overall look on, and we were just looking at the education bills. Another bill that we opposed that according to the notes I took last night from government, state government source, the school chaplain bill. That's another one that could be problematic. And I won't get in, we don't have time for me to get into what all is there. But the good news on that is the schools get a choice if they want to have these volunteer chaplains come in. Then there's some other bills. There's one where as usual, you know, the train bills, the bills with so much bundled into it. So, anyway, as was said on the last call I was on, it could have been worse.
Thank you, Betsy. Lana Cowell and Jacqueline McMiller were not able to attend this morning, but they have been leading an affordable housing committee. And that committee has been very active, and we even received an award from the League of Women Voters Florida for our advocacy. And one of the major issues they've been working on is the CDBG-DR, the $1.1 billion that the county is spending, and looking at transparency and fairness in that process, and a number of other affordable housing issues that are coming up in the at the county and the city level. So I thank them for their work, and for all the members of that committee who, as I said, have been working very hard on that. Our event coordinator, Nancy Leverance, in the back. Do you have something you want to say, Nancy?
Yeah, for the league members, we meet October through May, so this summer we won't be meeting. Try to read the emails because she always puts in something about volunteer events. And we've been running a little low on the volunteers, so see if you can't pull in, because between now and November, there's going to be a lot of forums, there's going to be a lot of events that we need to educate people. So try to look at that volunteer thing and put your name under if you can.
Thank you, Nancy. And Nancy will be following up with you on that as well, because we will have activity over the summer, even though we're not having our educational events. Observer Corps, Sue Osen. I think it's okay. It's on.
Okay. As always, I am looking for new observers for different municipalities for Cape Coral. I need a new one for the county commission. He's moving to Iowa. And please just contact me through the league, and I'll be glad to appoint you. The observer attends the city council or the area council meetings and reports on what they're doing that affects the league here, that affects our action list of what we're doing: education, health, social justice, affordable housing. We have many, many areas of interest, the environment especially today, and mine personally, the wells and the aquifer. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And for those of you who do attend government meetings, whenever you attend, if you'd like to send us information, we would be much appreciative. So we don't have coverage for all, but we do want to know what's happening. So our final issue before we move into the program is climate and environment and water quality. And our director for climate is Adrienne Kaltman, and I was hoping she would be on Zoom. I think she'll join. Is she? I didn't see her. I'm here. Okay. Hi, Adrienne. Did you want to say anything?
Well, I just wanted to say that I am very much looking forward to today's program. You know, water and climate are so interrelated, especially in Florida, where we have water in so many forms. We have a tremendous amount of annual rainfall. We have waters and tributaries, and we have a tremendous coastline, larger than I think any other state in the country. So we are significantly challenged on all fronts. I also wanted to say how proud I am to be a member of our dynamic organization. For the size of our organization, we are a power force in Florida. And I want to thank everybody on the board and off-board directors for everything that they do. And thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne. And also Clara Ann Graham, past president of the league, has been working on environmental issues. She hasn't joined us yet. And finally, before we move to the program, which is a few more moments, water quality, we have Mary Kay Robbins Kralip, who organized the Florida Right to Clean Water activity, and I've asked her to say a few words. We've been working in partnership with that organization. We need to continue to work with them, and we appreciate that they were here today collecting petitions.
It's very kind of you to have us here. As we all know that there's been a lot of activities within the environment recently. This past week, we had the BMAP review, we had the TMDL that they're talking about putting together. And here's the thing, even though we have been struggling day after day to try to get things better, the water is getting worse. And the only way that we're going to be able to stop that is if we do something that puts the people back in charge of water quality. And that's what this amendment does. This amendment allows for all of us to have a say in being able to clean the waters up once and for all. And I can only encourage you to please, please, please sign our petition. We need about 900,000. That's a lot. We missed it the last time. We're going to do it this time. So 2026, this is it. We're going to do it. And here's the other aspect about it. If you signed in Lee County, you're going to be getting a letter. And that letter is going to give you 3 petitions. And those petitions, we want you to get your friends and neighbors to sign and send them back because there'll be a self-addressed stamped envelope. Yay, right? You can do it. So, thank you. Because my friends, as Audrey Hepburn said, water is life and clean water means health. Go with it. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you for all your work, and we will be working with you. So any members who would like to be involved in gathering petitions, I'm sure we can make that happen. One final announcement, and Lorna just reminded me, Life is having a Nehemiah action on Tuesday evening, and all of you will get that information this weekend. And the major topic is mental health, is that correct? And also housing? And our issue this year, mental health, we're talking about helping individuals that are transported for Baker Act. So everyone is invited. We'll send information out. Tuesday, is it Fort Myers High School? Is that, where is it? Where is it? Unity of Fort Myers. Okay, so if you're on our email distribution list, you will get that information. If you're not, you can sign up for it today. Sign up on our list today. Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much. As you can see, we're involved in a lot of activities thanks to the hard work of our board and members and our partnerships with community organizations. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Marcia Ellis, who has been an active member of our affordable housing and is also a strong environmental advocate. She's going to introduce our speaker. Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandy. Good morning, Patriots. Thank you for joining us this morning on National Love Your Children Day, pulling yourself away from National Baking Week to hear from our esteemed speaker about a critical topic. Matt DePaolis is the Environmental Policy Director for Sanibel-Captiva Conservation Foundation, affectionately SCCF, a bastion of for conservation and defender of the environment in Southwest Florida. In my interactions with Matt, he has shown a commitment to leading and supporting through community partnership. His knowledge and action advocating for sound environmental policy teaches us how to amplify and validate our community voice and input. Matt has stood alongside communities challenging irresponsible development and density increases in the coastal high hazard flood areas. Through his engagement, he has given us, the public, the language to speak with precision, to give competent and substantive evidence, supported by science and studies, facts, and our observations. Matt has empowered community voice to enable us to confidently assert positions to safeguard ecological function today and to preserve the environment and our natural resources for future generations of Floridians. How do we support our positions, not opinions, our positions effectively? How does public engagement achieve results? How do we maximize impact when time allotted for spoken comment is often limited? What tools are available to assist us in moving contemporaneous science and studies, response to changing conditions, climate, natural disaster, pollution, impacts of urbanization, and widespread loss of biological diversity into policy and action? The Lee County League of Women Voters has asked Matt to come here today to share the recent economic study that's sponsored by SCCF, the Conservancy and Captains for Clean Water, to teach us how to be better advocates by incorporating the recent study into our public comment, to isolate some data and statistics to additionally submit in the written record to make it available for review. The recent study forebodes and quantifies the devastating economic impacts resulting from catastrophic harmful algae blooms. This study includes details of the impacts to the sectors, losses to jobs, property value and tax revenue, and diminishment to quality of life. Economic arguments carry credence and legally prevail. These victories create precedent to counterbalance perspectives and markers of prosperity that are currently singularly reliant on growth and development and far too often serve insider interest. I see a room full of wise souls today, and algal blooms are nature's way of regulating excesses in impaired waters. Our excesses are exceeding the carrying capacity of our community to the peril of biological life across species. Regulatory duty and policies protecting natural resources have been vacated and undermined by civic leadership. Matt will share today the economic consequences. When we directly link the recent study to our experiences through unsafe working conditions, aerosol drift in our homes, or through exposure in recreation, for example, as specific adverse harm, this advocacy will translate into policy and action. You will walk away today equipped and inspired to be that catalyst for change. Matt DePaolis, please come forward. All right.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Following review.
Yes.
That introduction is better than my talk is going to end up being.
Oh, stop it.
So I do have slides. How do we? Okay.
Okay.
Hold on one sec. Yeah.
Let's see, mute.
No, I need this. You could even put your stick in here and just share screen. Everyone has sharing.
Okay.
Anyone can screen share.
Well, is it up? Do you want to do that, Sandy, or do you want to see if we're operating off of here now?
entertainment. Oh, okay. We're just setting up. If anybody would like to share any news of the UConn Iowa basketball game, which I watched last night.
Spectacular baseball. I mean, basketball.
So I just wanted to take this opportunity to let everybody know that we are going to be doing a kickoff of the Right to Clean Water initiative for the Southwest area of Florida. Friends of the Wildlife is going to be hosting. Matt's going to be one of the speakers. Our very own Cody, who is the Calusa Waterkeeper, is going to be a speaker. Gil Stewart, who is with Vote Blue, is going to be a speaker. And it's a webinar, so you can sign up and do it by webinar. And if you guys would like, I can shoot it to Sandy, and you guys can spread the word and let everybody know. Yeah, it's thank you, the 18th at noon. Yeah, it's a couple weeks, like real soon. Webinar. Thank you. I thought I'd just, you know.
I'd like to share if you don't mind. Okay, great. Guys, I have an event I would really like to share with everyone and encourage folks to come out for. This is going to be so much fun. So recently at the Board of County Commissioners meeting on April 2nd, they declared April 10th coming up Gopher Tortoise Day. So we appreciate that proclamation. And in celebration of Gopher Tortoise Day, the Calusa Nature Center is hosting an event. I think around 5, you'll have to check the site for the time, a reception followed by the release, and this is a statewide release of a movie called Gopher Games that is educating the state about the plight of gopher tortoises, which are a keystone species for 130 others that live in those burrows. Recently, a new nonprofit has formed up, the East Lee Wildlife Stewardship Group, that is working in collaboration with the Nature Center. So this is going to be a kid-friendly event to raise awareness for the gopher tortoises. We're really targeting Lehigh Acres and East Lee because so many of those tortoises are being entombed with site work that's happening because there are no environmental surveys for properties less than 5 acres. So we're coming together as a community to address the plight of the gopher tortoise. There's ongoing litigation led by the Center for Biological Diversity, trying to secure federally endangered status for the species. If you have no kids, families, have grandchildren and children, please come on out for this event and show your support as we rally around the gopher tortoise. It's at the Calusa Nature Center, so it's going to be the evening of April 10th. I've been also coordinating with the Natural Resources Branch. We're planning an educational virtual event sometime on April 17th. I don't have the time ahead of me, and we're going to be looking at incineration from a statewide perspective, considering moving that topic forward. So if you are interested, look for the notice on that, where we'll be talking about the future of waste management in the state of Florida and looking at that issue as well. And you'll have a chance to see faces from all across the state. Anyone else have some events you want to share?
I'm Sue DeHodas. I'm a member of the Right to Clean Water advocacy group, but also Calusa Waterkeeper. And just to let you know, we're going to be having some vertical oyster garden workshops through the summer. We have one out on Pine Island on Monday. I think it's pretty fully subscribed. But we're planning to we're going to be talking a little bit about the value of oysters and
Also a little bit about what Calusa Waterkeeper does. But we're also going to be making vertical oyster gardens at these events. So just stay tuned. You'll see at Calusa Waterkeeper, we'll be sending out information. And would we collaborate with them, with the League of Women Voters? Okay, we can make sure you get the information as well.
But essentially they hang from the top of the tanking house. They do help quite a bit to filter the water. Every little bit counts. As we know, this isn't going to be the cure-all, but it definitely gives individuals an opportunity to learn about the water and how we can each play a role in helping to make sure we keep our water clean. So, and I'm Connie Ramos-Williams, the new executive director for Calusa Waterkeeper. So I'm proud to be here today and I will be signing up to be a member. So.
Okay, thank you for bearing with us through those technical difficulties. I think we're all set. I'm waving to camera up there. And everyone in the room can hear me and see the slides. So I'm Matt DePaolis. I'm the Environmental Policy Director for the Sanibel-Captiva Conservation Foundation. And I want to talk today a little bit about water quality, a little bit about the economic impacts of water quality, and kind of how my job interplays with those and why it's important to be engaged and involved, especially in our coastal communities here. In order to do that, I think it's important to have a little bit of background of what our water quality issues are, what we mean when we say we have impaired waterways, what those causes are, and then also just a little bit about the work that I do and my organization does, so you understand why you'll see me popping up all over the state complaining about this stuff. So the Sanibel-Captiva Conservation Foundation is an organization that started as a land trust in 1967. Started on Sanibel Island with the idea that the best way to conserve an area that you care about and are passionate about is to buy that land and prevent it from entering into development. We still adhere to that policy today. We're still purchasing land. We're the single largest private landowner on Sanibel, with over 2,000 acres on Sanibel and surrounding areas of land that's actually held in trust for conservation by our organization. And we manage that through our wildlife management team, and then also have anyone online could mute themselves, please. Thank you. So we have a much larger organization than we did originally back when we were founded. We've ballooned since then into really doing anything that we feel furthers our mission of protecting and caring for Southwest Florida's coastal ecosystem. So we have the Sanibel Sea School was a recent merger with that is a school that functions on Sanibel, and its whole goal is to get kids out into the resource, into the coastal environment, into the ocean, to really make that connection at a young age with how cool and how important these resources are, so that hopefully they carry those experiences with them throughout their lives and make decisions in the future based on their experiences they had as a child. Coastal Watch is our volunteer arm, so that allows us to really expand the impact that we have with some of these projects, because when you're talking about planting mangroves or building an oyster reef where there wasn't one before it, you need a lot of manpower and a lot of man hours that go into the projects like that. So, and we couldn't do that without our volunteers. Then especially when you're talking about some of our other volunteer programs like the shorebird monitoring and the sea turtle monitoring, we have people out on the beaches 24 hours a day during turtle monitoring season. So volunteers and interns really come through with that. And then the main organization, SCCF, has a active marine lab that is functioning to bring the cutting edge science to us so we can utilize it when we're doing our advocacy work. We have wildlife management that I mentioned, and that's the shorebird and sea turtle. We have habitat management that does controlled burns on the island, that manages the lands that we have. We have a native plant and garden center that runs out of the historic Bailey Homestead. So we help people make decisions on their own properties about which plants and organisms they can be attracting to their land so that they don't need to irrigate irrigate a lot, to use a lot of fertilizers, and to have some of these impacts that can scale when we're talking about the amount of individual homeowners who are making these same decisions. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, this is basically everything I talked about and more. We do a lot at the organization, so I get excited talking about it. Well, it's a great organization to work for. I work on the policy department. I am the policy director, and then Holly Schwartz and Ali Pasenka are research and policy associates that I have on my team, and I'm lucky enough to have on my team. They both do amazing work. And it's really important to have a lot of dedicated people in this job because there's so much work to do. That's what I tell everyone, is the one thing about this job is there's job security in it, because everywhere you turn, there's something that you could be getting involved in. And when we're talking about protecting and caring for Southwest Florida's coastal ecosystems, I get the question a lot of like, why are you here when I'm showing up in the East Coast or Tallahassee or DC, in places that are pretty far from our little island that's situated in the Gulf of Mexico? And the answer to that is that everything in South Florida is so interconnected that I need to be here. I need to be on the East Coast and up in Tallahassee, and wherever the decisions are being made that are impacted our waters, that's where the advocacy needs to happen. And when we're talking about South Florida, basically, if you have a drop of water that falls on the state south of Orlando, that drop has a chance of impacting our estuary here in the Caloosahatchee. We live in such a controlled system where people are making decisions on how to manage that water, how to move that water around the state, that those decisions have such a large outsized impact on the health of our estuary, the health of our fisheries, the health of our environment down here, that we need people in the room regardless of where that is. And those decision makers don't come down here all the time. So that's why we have to travel. So we're engaging, as I said, South Florida, which means everything from Orlando to Key West, the municipal, county, state, and all the way up to the federal decision makers, especially in the Army Corps. And so we do a lot on the policy department. We do legislative tracking, we do data evaluation and modeling. We do our Caloosahatchee conditions report that actually is two different products we put out every week, one aimed at water managers and one aimed at the lay public. And that encapsulates what's going on in the Caloosahatchee River and the lake for that week. For the more technical document, it actually gives a recommendation to water managers. So the South Florida Water Management District and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will look at that document and factor that into their management decisions. And then the water tracker, I have an example later here, but it's much more easy to digest. It's one big image with bright colors on it, so you can look at it immediately and see how the algae blooms are doing, what the lake height is, and where the water is going. And I'll show you that later. But that's something that if you're interested in what I have to say today, you can sign up for our email list, and that'll show up in your inbox every week. Yeah. Absolutely. The conditions tracker and the weekly report are completely saved up there, so you can go and look back and actually see the data of what's been going on, what our recommendations were, and how those management choices changed based on those. So I mentioned our mission at SCCF is to protect and care for Southwest Florida's coastal ecosystems. And that's a pretty wide berth of what I'm able to engage with, because when we think of our coastal ecosystems, that's basically the driving force of our communities down here in Lee County, in Collier County, in Charlotte County. We really rely on our coasts, not only for our own way of life, for our own enjoyment, but it's one of the driving engines of tourism that's bringing people down here to visit. And it's one of the reasons people are coming down here to stay as well. So when we're talking about protecting and caring for Southwest Florida's coastal ecosystems, we're really talking about protecting and caring for our whole communities. Because as was mentioned earlier, we have these issues that are being decided further inland, whether it's in Alva or beyond up in Clewiston, and the ramifications of those decisions are felt downstream where we sit at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee. So when we need to engage for the protection of a coastal ecosystem, it's not just what we may think of as a beach or a mangrove fringe, but it goes much further inland than that. I have about 4 main buckets that I focus on in my day-to-day. That's not to say I don't do more than this. I have a pretty wide-ranging job where I'll engage in pretty disparate issues. As I mentioned, like water quality decisions is something that crops up pretty much on a daily, if not weekly basis. But there are more interesting, or not more interesting, but there's different disparate issues that I find pretty interesting too. So some things we engage on are oil drilling concerns, whether they be offshore oil drilling or oil drilling in Big Cypress that has a chance to impact water quality. There's been a lot of talk recently in the past few years about siting a massive aquaculture farm right off the coast of Sarasota. And it's issues like that that I really enjoy digging into because they can be so complex and there are so many different nuanced views that when you're engaging with these, it's really important to understand the whole issue. Because just thinking about like a massive fin fishery aquaculture farm, well, that's going to, if we put it in, reduce the pressures on local fisheries, and that will probably be good for the fisheries in the surrounding area. And that's the claim that's being made by a lot of people. However, the flip side of that, if you're thinking about it from a different standpoint, is the coast of Sarasota is the red tide initiation zone. We know that's where a lot of red tide blooms start. So maybe sticking a giant, essentially aquatic factory that's forming more nutrients constantly offshore right in that area isn't the smartest decision to make going forward based on the health of our coast. So we wade into a bunch of different issues like that. And a lot of it is focused on water quality. That's Everglades restoration, water management, and algae blooms primarily. Everglades restoration is something I'll touch on in more depth in a second here, but it's really one of the driving components to getting our water right in the Caloosahatchee. You hear a lot about Lake Okeechobee when we're talking about algae blooms, when we're talking about water conditions. And there's a few reasons for that. One of them, first and foremost, is we're kind of the dumping ground or one of two dumping grounds for Lake Okeechobee. That water, when it gets too high, either goes east or west, and we're the western outlet for that. So the sheer volume of water that can come out of that lake really can upset the natural order of our estuary. It pushes the salinity gradient out too far. It stresses the organisms within the estuary. So that's a really big issue. But on top of that, Lake Okeechobee is a massive nutrient source. That lake has about a 3-foot muck layer sitting on the bottom of it that is pure nutrients from decades of back pumping from the agriculture communities south of the lake. They would actually take the water from the lake. When they were done with it, back pump it back into the lake to store it for later use. But when it would go back into the lake, it was full of nutrients from all of the intensive agriculture practices that they were doing down there. So the lake is a huge issue when we're talking about our own water quality, but it's not the only issue. It's really important to remember that about 50% of our problem, give or take, depending on who you talk to, comes from within the basin itself. So even if we were to fix the lake today, that's an easy target. It's great to point to and say, this is something we need to solve. But we'd still have about half the problem that we would need to solve within our own basin by ourselves, removed from the federal government, removed from the Army Corps, removed from those management decisions. So it's really important not to get completely caught up in these solutions that are only thinking about the lake. And we need to start thinking about solutions for the Caloosahatchee as well. Land use is a huge issue. You'll notice when I'm talking about the issues that I deal with, everything is really so tied together because land use has huge impacts on water quality. Climate change has huge impacts on water quality. Land use has huge impacts on climate change. All of these things are really just fighting for that larger mission of protecting and caring for our local communities. But land use in Lee County specifically is really, really important, especially at this stage where we're seeing unprecedented development. We're seeing development interests moving in under the guise of resilience, under the guise of hurricane rebuilding, and we're losing wetlands every year at a time when we really need to be understanding the importance of wetlands, the ecological factors that are coming out of wetlands that we're able to capitalize on, whether they're storm protection, whether they're carbon capture, whether they're water filtration, whether they're wildlife habitat. These lands that we still have are growing more important every day. So conservation is a huge factor. Doing effective mitigation when necessary, not overutilizing mitigation, and protecting the lands that we have left takes up a lot of my time as well. So coming from a land trust, that's a great place to be, is just trying to get more land set aside for conservation. Development pressures, we're all familiar with the 1,000 people a day that are coming to Florida. development and people traveling and migration is great and necessary, and it's something that is not going away anytime soon, but it's not something that we don't have to do with careful forethought. It's not something that we have to say, okay, 1,000 people are coming to Florida. Each one of them needs a single family home with an irrigated yard wherever we can afford to stick it. Let's put them there and then move on to the next one. Instead, we need to be thinking about how we're doing development, how we're going to effectively fit these people onto this peninsula in a way that we still have a Florida in 50 years. So I hope to get people to think creatively about how we're doing development. And then legislative impacts, we're engaged with that a lot during the legislative session. We track what's going on up in Tallahassee. We package that into a legislative update every week. We have a legislative tracker on our website so people can engage, be informed about what's going on up in Tallahassee. And then if you sign up for our action alerts and there's good bills going through that need support, if there's bad bills going through that need opposition, then we'll send an advocacy alert to your email inbox. You click a couple buttons, fill out a form, and that sends a letter directly to wherever it needs to go to show your support or opposition for those. So that's one way that we boost our own advocacy efforts, by leaning on our membership. That was successful, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too, during this legislative session. And now we're in the veto session after legislative session, where people are waiting for the Tallahassee to send those bills that did pass to the governor for his signature. And then he has either 15 days to sign or not sign those bills and allow them or not to become law. So even though we're done with legislative session, it's not over. It's never over. And then coastal resilience is huge when you live in a barrier island community, a coastal community, and it's really important to be thinking about both adaptation and mitigation when we're talking about coastal resilience. Too often, I feel like one or the other gets leaned on too heavily, when we need to be working in concert with both understanding that the problems are here now, they're affecting us. Anyone who lived through Ian knows that was, especially if they've lived through storms prior to Ian, can understand the cost of getting more energy in these massive hurricanes that are affecting our coasts. So we need to make realistic movement to deal with the problems we have, but we also need to be mitigating to lessen the impact of future problems as well. And we do it all over, from Tallahassee to DC. So one major concern with our water quality specifically, probably the number one issue that's being talked about right now today, certainly, but overall, the one thing that's easiest to affect, so I think it gets a lot of action, is the regional water management decisions. And I touched on that a little bit, but I really want you to understand what we're talking about when we say the Everglades, South Florida, is a managed system. So no, it's a little hard to see for people in the back here, but this is south of Florida. The green area starts just below Orlando. That's the Kissimmee Valley Lakes chain that flows into Lake Okeechobee. And then that big blue arrow that goes down to Florida Bay is the historic Everglades. So when people were talking about the Everglades as a river of grass, it was actually a river. It was a river that was about 60 miles wide, 100 miles long. It moved about a half a mile a day. It was super shallow and super slow. And what it did was, on its journey moving from Okeechobee, where it overtopped the southern bank in a laminar sheet flow and moved all the way to Florida Bay, it would be scrubbed clean by the sawgrass that was there, by the plants that was in there. In the process, it would form this really unique environment for all the animals that we think of in historic Florida that lived in the Everglades and called it its home. And then by the time that water was crystal clear, coming out the south end in Florida Bay, it was able to provide the perfect habitat for rampant seagrass growth in that bay, which in turn allowed juvenile fisheries and smaller fisheries to grow, increasing the benefits to the fin fisheries in the Florida Keys and South Florida. So all of these systems are so interconnected. Everything that draws people to this place really starts with water. And this is what it looked like before 1875. That's where we were at. Now, when people started coming to the state and they saw the Everglades as this massive swamp, this place of alligators and bugs, and it's impossible to get a boat through and a horse couldn't walk through it, they really thought that this was not being put to its best and highest usage. And historically, when people are talking about best and highest usage in the United States, they're generally thinking agriculture. So that's what people thought when they saw the Everglades. They had a pretty simple idea when Hamilton Diston came down here in 1886, 1888 and saw the Everglades and decided that, you know, water flows downhill. There's not much of a hill in Florida, but there's a little bit between the Everglades and the ocean. So if we just dig a big enough ditch, drain enough of it, the water should flow off the land, and then we'll have all this great land available for agriculture. So that's what he started. That was his dream. He never saw his dream realized, but others came in after him and essentially drained, ditched, and dredged until we have the Everglades agriculture area like we do today, which is this huge area south of the Everglades, where mostly sugar and some other vegetables and crops are farmed today. So now you can see every blue arrow on this map is an option for where water can be put. And that's not where water is naturally going to flow, like on that last image where it was coming out of Lake Okeechobee. Each one of these blue arrows is a different canal with a different lock structure that can be opened or shut based on a decision being made by a water manager. So you can see that there's basically 4 options for water to come out of the lake. It can either go east to the St. Lucie, it can go west to us, it can go south into the agriculture area, which they take water drawdown for their crops, or it can bypass that and go south down into the Everglades, where it historically needed to go, where it desperately needs to go today to rehydrate that area. Unfortunately, as I mentioned previously, the waters of Lake Okeechobee are so polluted that we're not able to put that water directly into the Everglades. It doesn't meet the phosphorus limit. Now, when we're talking about polluted water, I can get confusing for people because I think a lot of the times when you're thinking to what you think of when you were taught about polluted water and the EPA and the environmental actions of the 1970s, dirty water can look like anything from a factory spewing chemicals directly into the water. It can be a river catching on fire, or some of these other really drastic chemical-based impairments. However, in Florida, generally, when we're talking about impaired water, we're talking about nutrient impairment. So that's nitrogen and phosphorus that is in the watershed, generally because it was being used for a beneficial purpose at the time. Nutrients are necessary for plant growth. That's why we apply them to our lawns. That's why we apply them to our crops. And a lot of that will be applied and then wash into the waterways surrounding them. Now, those same chemicals that were great for growing plants on land are also great for growing plants in the water as well, and generally will be taken up by whatever can do it the fastest. So in the Everglades, where it's a phosphorus limited environment, generally what would grow best was sawgrass, and it would create the unique environment that we saw and still see to this day in the Everglades. However, if you tweak that balance at all and increase that phosphorus even a little bit, what you start to see is cattails moving in, and they'll quickly uptake all that phosphorus much more effectively than the natural plants will. Now, cattails might look similar to sawgrass on some level, but are really a completely different plant. They grow much thicker, they're much more difficult to get through, and they will completely choke out all the other organisms that are used to using that sawgrass, whether they're other plants who are trying to grow there or even animals who are trying to pass through those environments where they previously couldn't. So that's why we have restrictions on the amount of phosphorus that can go into the Everglades. However, now we're in this situation where we're stuck with a bunch of phosphorus laden water up in Lake Okeechobee, and we have no option to send it to the Everglades, and ag doesn't want it because they have all the water they need for that year. So it gets pushed out into the estuaries, dumping billions of gallons of fresh water directly into the ocean. And remember that they're full of these nutrients. So what generally uptakes the nutrients fastest in the freshwater environment of the Caloosahatchee River, and once it gets to the coast, the marine environment, is algae. And that's why we talk about these lake releases, these polluted water releases being so connected to large harmful algal blooms. Generally, what we see in freshwater of the lake and the river are the blue-green algae blooms, which are potentially toxic. Just because you see blue-green algae in the water doesn't mean it is toxic. It has to be taken to a lab for testing. There's no way to just know looking at it, but it does have that potential to be toxic. And then once we get out into the ocean and the estuary, that can either be seen in the form of toxic red algae or red tide, or it could be in macroalgae, which is think like kelp basically, or if you like sushi, the green part that's wrapped around the sushi is also a macroalgae. But the ones that we see here blooming in massive amounts are generally stringy, fibrous. They're not held together in the same way as like a big food kelp that you might think of. But what happens is they will bloom. They form huge floating mats. It blocks out the sun for seagrass underneath it. And then when eventually they do use up all the nutrients available, the algae will die. It floats to the bottom. It starts to rot. That uses up all the oxygen from the bacteria rotting through that and creates an anoxic environment, which is harmful to other organisms there as well. So even if macroalgae, which isn't toxic on its own, undergoes one of these massive bloom events, it can be hugely detrimental to the ecosystem surrounding it as well. So this is just a long way of saying that we're very, very concerned about the water management decisions being made in this lake. We want as much, ideally in a perfect situation, all that water would be going south to the Everglades. That's where it went historically. That's where it belongs. That's where it can do the most good, provided we can get it below the phosphorus threshold that's making it detrimental to that environment. So what that's going to take is large Everglades restoration projects. There's a lot being done right now. There's a lot that have been being done for a really long time. I'm sure many of you have heard about Everglades restoration before. And I'm sure it's always something that seems like a monolithic event that's just happening. It's always been happening. It always will be happening. And that's because these projects, the scale of these projects mean that they take so long to get done. When I'm on calls with some of my colleagues, we get really excited about timelines like 2030. Once 2030 gets here, the reservoir will be online, and then we'll start to see direct impacts. And that can be really discouraging for people that aren't able to compartmentalize as well as I can. But I think that it's really important to be able to see the wins that we're having and the development that is occurring that is changing the impacts we're seeing on the ground. I think a really good example is not necessarily of hard structures that are being implemented, but in a change in thinking that's occurring that we're seeing in real time in the Army Corps. That's really important when we're talking about water management decisions. And if you go back to after Irma, we had a similar situation where hurricanes came across Florida. They dumped a bunch of water in the lake. The lake level rose very, very high. And the Army Corps was trying to get the water out of the lake as fast as possible. And what we saw in the next summer, there was a big active blue-green algae bloom on the lake. The Army Corps didn't care. They dumped all that water down the Caloosahatchee. And that's what led to the lost summer here, where we had massive blue-green algae blooms all over the lake. Cut to Ian, same thing. Ian came across, Nicole came across, the lake rose by 2 feet. The lake was super, super high. And we saw blue-green algae blooms starting on the lake again over the summer. There was a point where it was 98% covered in blue-green algae this summer or last summer. And what the Corps did was they flexed operational flexibility, which was this new term they had come up with throughout their next manual iteration. And they decided to bank that water, hold it for a later date, and not release that water while it was algae laden down the Caloosahatchee, giving us the ramifications of those blue-green algae blooms right when we were still trying to rebuild some from Ian to the degree that we were that summer. I think that was a great decision. It saved us a lot of grief from those blue-green algae blooms. Now we're in a different situation where the lake is higher than it would be if they had just been dumping on us all summer. But this kind of shows the razor's edge that we always have to be walking, because we need to see what we need to understand what the ramifications long-term and short-term are a decision. Is there a question? Yeah.
It's the decision-making process about how much money is or how much water is sent our way versus to the East Coast.
Yeah, so the question was, what's the decision-making mechanism for sending water east versus west? And there's two answers. There is a manual that the Army Corps uses. Currently, it's LORS 08. That's basically a flow chart that says how much water they can release based on the height of the lake, east or west. And depending on how high the lake is, how far you are in the season, that allows you to send a certain amount of water east and west. Now we're moving away from that and into LOSUM, which is the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. And it's the same general idea. Depending on how high the lake is, you're able to send a certain amount of water east or west. But there's a much larger degree of operational flexibility built into that system. So that's where the boundaries are. So basically, unless we're in a very high or very low lake stage in a very dry or very wet conditions, we will have the option to be sending 2,000 cubic feet per second west and nothing going east. Now the band above that, that jumps significantly to the east and a little bit to the west. But the main reason that we see that discrepancy between the east and west, because it right off on it, when you look at it, it seems like, well, it's not fair. We're getting 2,000, they get 0. There's all these instances where we get some and they get none. And that's really because of the nuance of what we're trying to manage for on the West Coast is so much more difficult and touchy than what's going on the East Coast. So we're in a situation where we need water during the dry season. There are times when the basin runoff is so little during the dry season, we've been getting no rain, that we absolutely need some water coming from Lake Okeechobee in order to move water through that system, in order to push the salinity gradient out in the estuary. Otherwise, those saline conditions will push all the way up to Alva, and that stresses the tape grass in the river, that stresses the oysters in the river. So there is a time of year when we need water coming out of the or coming out of our outlet on the West Coast. The East Coast never wants any water. They would be happy without having any. They're spring fed in their system. They don't want to be used as a release valve. There's mechanical issues because we're just physically a larger release valve than they are. We can just physically take more water than they can. And what we're seeing is when we try to engage in these discussions and the West Coast says, well, we physically can take a little bit of water and we want some water now. So let's work to get us to a place where we're getting a safe amount of water and you can share some adversity and take water. And that historically has been met with, well, they want water. Why don't they just take all the water? And that kind of shuts down the conversation. Because anytime you're having a nuanced discussion and someone wants to cut off the nuance, that really hinders what you're talking about. We're seeing a much better engagement with our partners over on the East Coast. Stakeholders are all realizing that when East and West are pointing the finger at each other, no one's really talking about the agriculture community. No one's talking about the sugar community. No one's talking about the reason that any of this is really occurring. Because at the end of the day, if this system was being managed for the environment, for the health of the estuaries, there would be no reason to keep the lake as high as we're keeping it right now. The only reason we have to keep the lake up 14, 15, 16 feet is to supply every potential drop of water done by the modeling that was carried out by the lobbyists for the sugar industry. And once that's satisfied, only then can we release water. But that means that we artificially store water in the lake up until it becomes a dangerous point. And once it becomes dangerous, then the lake is being managed at its base for flood control to ensure that no loss of life occurs south of the lake. So they open the floodgates and dump it. We're really in this situation where we need people to understand what the issue is, not say, well, they're not taking any, so we should, or we're taking it all. Why don't they take more? And when we all can practice shared adversity and say, listen, nobody likes the situation right now. The lake is 16 feet. We need to get water down realistically, but we're taking water on the west. They're taking water on the east. Why is no one taking water on the south? Why are we not moving water south into every cubic foot available of canal space, of water conservation area, all these places that are just never talked about in the dialogue? So that's a really long way of saying it's complicated. Yeah.
Are engineers the ultimate decision makers? I'm not sure how the puzzle pieces fit together and how legislative impact or the governor or
How does that work? I don't know.
Yeah, so the South Florida Water Management District, that's one of those partners up on that list. They are a special governing body that was created by the state of Florida. It's an appointed position, so the governor selects the board members on there. And they have a lot of freedom with how that water is distributed around the state, with a big asterisk by it saying, as long as we don't have too much water or too little water, the South Florida Water Management District has a lot of power to move water around within the state itself. But at its core, the system was implemented for flood control. After two hurricanes in 1928 and 29, there was about 3,000 people lost their lives in Clewiston when those hurricanes hit the lake. And it was at that point that the Army Corps stepped in and started building the Herbert Hoover Dike around the lake. So primarily, if it comes down to it and becomes a safety decision, the Army Corps has the authority to do what needs to be done to make it a safe decision again. But there is that center area where the South Florida Water Management District has a lot of free reign, and it's only going to increase during LOSUM once that is implemented because of that operational flexibility.
That, I see partners where that's, yeah. Anyway, so I know that Big Sugar has a lot of the clout with the money they hand out to local governments, to legislators and all of that. Has that, it's the first thing I heard when I moved to Florida about the Big Sugar. And has that gotten any better, or is it about the same? I'm just curious. I mean, you would think that local governments would want to keep their areas looking beautiful and be healthy and the water and all of that. But it's been my experience that many of them, many of the elected people have blinders and they're just looking for money.
Absolutely. I think the sugar industry is very active in their usage of the lobbying industry. I think that a lot of decisions are being made based on claims from the sugar industry, but when you dig down into the claims being made, I think a great example was when the Herbert Hoover Dike came in, or when it was needing to be rehabilitated, excuse me, it necessarily lowered the amount of water available to the sugar industry because they were rehabbing the dike, so the whole lake needed to be kept lower. Throughout that time where the lake was being kept significantly lower than the modeling needed, or what the modeling said was needed from the sugar industry, their yields actually went up during that time because they were managing their own water better because there was not this unlimited bank that they're normally used to having. So a lot of these claims that are made by the industry are really accepted with an uncritical ear. And I think lobbying dollars probably goes to help accepting that. And that's what I'm going to touch on in a second here, is the importance of really having economic data to back up the claims you're making. Because that's what people really want to hear, especially when you're talking to decision makers. And I'll point out something in a little bit, but I just want you to remember that the sugar industry, when they're talking about the effect that any impact to their bottom line would have, they talk about how over 9,000 jobs would be impacted, and that's an important number to remember. But I'll try to move through here quickly. I can see I'm going over time, so sorry about that. But so regional water management is something that we engage with all the time. And like I said, our partners are the South Florida Water Management District, the Army Corps, other NGOs in the area, local governments, and basically any other stakeholders that want to get involved. Recently, since 2018, a great partner for us has actually been the Sanibel Chamber of Commerce. After the 2018 red tide that absolutely ransacked our island, the Chamber of Commerce stepped up and said, what do we do so this never happens again? How do we protect water quality? And since then, they've been an excellent partner. They really understand that our livelihoods as Floridians, as Lee Countyans, really rely on a healthy environment. And it's great to be able to have the business community standing next to you when you're going up to your local leaders and representatives, because that adds the power of something rather than just a conservation group or just an environmental group. So we touched on all this. This is just going through the history of the Everglades. These are some large projects that are important for rehabbing the Everglades. Some of them affect us in different ways. There's things like the Tamiami Trail bridging, which is restoring flows to the southern Everglades. When 41 was built, it effectively just became a wall across the Everglades, and people didn't think that much of it. But now, years later, the Everglades south of that area is really, really dry because it is being completely cut off from water. So if you've driven that road recently, you've probably noticed that your car goes up in certain places over little bridges, and that's what those are for. They're to restore that flow back down into the southern Everglades. So that is affecting us in the larger scale of this is Everglades restoration, and it's helping. It's one component of the larger project, but it's in terms of direct impacts for our area. The EAA reservoir, this upper right photo or pic image, is going to be one of the largest single projects that's going to impact the water quality that we have here in the Caloosahatchee. And that was the 2030 date I was getting excited about. This is a massive reservoir south of the lake, and effectively it's going to provide another outlet where we can move lake water when we need to in these emergency situations, where it can then be stored and treated, and then once it meets that phosphorus requirement, be sent south to the Everglades. That reservoir is massive, and it will take about 6 inches off the lake when we fill it up. There's another reservoir in the Caloosahatchee Basin. Oh, was there a question? And they will hold. So that's why. So the reservoirs have two components. There's the reservoir storage component, and there's a treatment component. So being built by those next to those reservoirs are stormwater treatment areas, which are essentially giant filter marshes. So the water will be taken from the reservoir, moved through that filter marsh, which will clean the water, and then that will be done to get it to that limit where it can be released into the Everglades. Because essentially, if we don't meet the standard for that phosphorus minimum, we can't move that water into the Everglades. And you're right, we are just storing dirty water. And there has been some discussion about if the STAs associated with this reservoir are large enough to clean the amount of water that is going to be held there. At this point, we don't know because it's all modeling. But the great thing about STAs is you can always build more and you can tack on more filter marshes. But once we have the reservoir in place, we'll be able to know whether that works or not. But waiting until we have a perfect pilot project and enough modeling and all of that is going to, and this process has already been going since 2000 and we're at this stage. So once we get this built, let's figure out how to get it clean too. Oh, yeah.
When the EAA is fully functional, what, in comparison to say the max flow going down the Caloosahatchee, how much less flow would there be using that reservoir? 5%, 6%?
So I think that flow isn't necessarily the best way to think about that, because if the lake gets to a point where it needs to get flow down the Caloosahatchee, you're still going to have to move those massive, massive volumes. And this won't be necessarily something that can accept flow at the same rate or volume of the Caloosahatchee. But what it will do is keep the lake lowered to a level where we don't have to move up into that next management band where the water has to be released from the lake. So it's not like if we're in a situation where we need to get water out of the lake, we'll have either the West Coast or the EA reservoir to open, but it's in those days leading up to the lake level rising that we'll be able to stagger that water coming out of the lake. And so it's more of a capacity than an immediate volume storage. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Terrible time to have the basis.
Yep.
Is the EAA going to mitigate that? Is the Corps going to fix it? How does it
Yeah, so right now I think is a perfect example of we've been in releases for 6-ish weeks now, 8 weeks, and we're in the middle of a pause to let the estuaries restore. If the EA reservoir was functional, we could be still drawing down the lake during this time while the floodgates are closed east and west. So it's just adding making the system more resilient and robust. Yes. Mhm. Yeah, so a lot of those canals are privately held. Some of them are state owned with the South Florida Water Management District, but it's really an issue. There's no, apart from incentives, there's not a strong mechanism to do that, to just move water into canals other than you could do it and then say, yes, this was a trespass on your canal, but but nothing came of it. If you were to, I mean, theoretically, you could raise the water table enough that it would oversaturate the crops. So you'd have to be very careful about that. But there is space sitting in canals that's just not being used right now, that they're just not moving on. So I'm going to go quick through these last few slides, so we can have more questions, but I think we've been doing good. This is that water conditions tracker. If you don't want the super technical document and just want a pretty picture to show up in your inbox, Allie, who I mentioned before, makes this every week. So this was our tracker from this week. This is where you can see the lake is at a little over 15 feet, which is great from 2 months ago. It's actually gone down. We're seeing hardly any flows come out of the lake. Those are 7-day averages. So 1300 is well within the limit that we want to be seeing at S79, which is 2200 is the maximum. Another great image, another great product that we put out is the drone photo. So every week we go fly a drone at the Lighthouse Beach down on Sanibel and stitch it all together so you can get this big panoramic shot of what the water quality looks at that particular time. And so this is a really powerful tool for multiple reasons. One, it allows us to go back and look at the other data and say, okay, the releases were doing this, wind conditions were like this, how is that affecting our water quality? But also when you're talking to people, whether they're tourists, other stakeholders, or decision makers, and you're able to say, this is exactly what your decisions are doing, and this is what they're resulting in, and that's how you're impacting what we're trying to do here in our community. It makes a really big impact. So you can see we have these great images of when the water is good. And then this is right after the hurricane. So that's not a management decision necessarily, but I think it is just a really stark contrast to see what the worst of the worst can be. So the economic impact of water quality is a study that's been mentioned a couple times. We commissioned it with our partners, Conservancy of Southwest Florida. Michelle's here today. Thanks for coming, Michelle. And Captains for Clean Water was also a great partner on that. And the Clusa Waterkeeper helped us out a lot with it as well. But so this was a study that really just looked at our water-based economy. So that was the coastal impact of the economic activity going on in that thin little narrow stretch in Charlotte to Collier County. So it's a really limited space that was actually looked at in this study. And the findings were massive. It was pretty incredible to be able to put some of these numbers together and be able to present them in this way that really got people to sit up and take notice. So just some numbers I'd like to point out. So lost property tax revenue of $60.3 million. And these are all numbers associated with a potential cost from one massive harmful algal bloom. So this is one single event can result in that narrow stretch of 3 counties resulting in this much damage. I want to point out too that these are conservative numbers. These are numbers that we're quantifying only what we knew we could quantify. So there's no ecosystem services reflected in this. The true value of a mangrove or an oyster reef or a seagrass bed that would be lost in an event like this or could be lost in an event like this isn't reflected here. Fishery value isn't reflected here. And the human health impacts are not reflected here. So any associated cognitive issues, lung issues, from blue-green algae, from red tide that you might see the ramifications on down the road, not captured here at all. This is strictly pure economic output. And when you're talking about lost coastal economic output of $5.2 billion from a single event, people really start to sit up and take notice. And when they're thinking about, hey, that's value for my constituents, people who are voting for me in my community that's lost, well, hopefully that will make them think about their decisions with extra specificity. And then really, so I just wanted to touch on that number that Sugar throws around a lot, is those 9,000 jobs that make the sugar industry hum. And those are the jobs that are at risk. Well, if we're talking 3 counties out here putting over 43,000 jobs at risk, suddenly the scales are starting to look a little bit more balanced when we're talking about valuation.
So we talked about the lost coastal economic output. It's taking like the tourism.
That's tourism, hotels, restaurants, boat captains, guiding.
But this is coastal adjacent zip codes, right? And this is only zip codes that are on the water. So this is not restaurants and hotels at Daniels Parkway and I-75, right? So, and we all know, so that's why I just want to put that makes this numbers even that much more conservative, because they're only looking at the whole thing. Yeah, when you go in just a little bit, you know it's still going to be factored as well. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. None of this is reflective of Lehigh. None of this is reflective of Alva. None of this is reflective of the general economic flow that comes from the coast to some of those interior places that is cut off with one of these events. So this has been a great tool for us to be able to go take this up to Tallahassee, take this to DC, and say, now here we have real numbers that we can point to in peer-reviewed data that shows the impact of the decisions you're making. And before, when it was an open secret, I mean, everyone knows that if you have a massive harmful algal bloom that shuts down your community for 6 months, that's going to have an economic impact on you. But just saying this will impact us is different than saying this will impact us to the tune of $5 billion. This will impact us to the tune of 43,000 of your voters will lose their job. And people start to sit up and take notice. So this has been an amazing tool that we've recently put out and are very excited to grow on it and expand it. Just a quick touch on 2024 legislative session. It's over now. Oh, is there a question quick? The blob. Yeah, so sargassum is one of my favorite macroalgae. It is a yellow macroalgae that actually grows little air pockets on it, so it floats on the top of the ocean. It's very important to the health of the Atlantic Ocean. There's a massive patch of it out in a gyre, which is a culmination of ocean currents that just goes in a circle. The center of that gyre, there's a huge patch of sargassum. And that's what's known as the Sargasso Sea. So this is actually vital to a lot of organisms throughout their life cycle. Sea turtles go there when they're juveniles and they hang out in the seagrass for protection. There's a lot of fish that use it for protection in various stages of their life. There's a lot of animals that eat it in an otherwise area of the ocean that has no nutrients in it. So it's really important for that. There's actually really cool dives you can do where you go and you dive upside down the whole time and you're just looking for little frogfish and stuff. But it is a macroalgae and it responds to nutrients just like any other macroalgae does. So the blob that occurred last summer that I'm sure we all heard about, I think that was mostly by virtue of the media coming hot off the heels of a red tide and catching wind of any other algae issues and just glomming onto that. Because when the blob stories were happening, there was a large amount of sargassum that was being generated in the Atlantic Ocean. Those inputs that are affecting that are not really the Caloosahatchee. It's more like the Amazon outputting into the ocean is going to have an impact on that Sargassum Sea. And then when it gets too large, it can break free of that gyre in the massive amount that we saw over the summer. But it's so complex to float through the Atlantic Ocean in the way that it does and make it all the way around to Sanibel that it was obviously very premature for our news media to be getting overly excited back in April of last year. And then by July, when it was supposed to hit us, of course, we saw it had veered off because of the way ocean currents work. So I think it is an issue when those massive amounts of macroalgae, regardless of the type of macroalgae, wash up on our beach. We see it when we have those impacts of red algae, red drift algae, sargassum stacked 3 feet high on the beach. That absolutely has a massive economic impact. People can't go to the beach. People aren't going to hang out. That stuff rots, and it has to be dealt with by municipalities and county budgets that aren't necessarily anticipating having to clean every beach for 3 months. But that's not generally what we're thinking about when we're thinking about macroalgae and detrimental blooms of that nature.
Question from chat. What is the working relationship with the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes?
It's good. It's growing every year. We're getting a better working relationship with them. I think that they are very interested in water quality, especially around their lands. But yeah, I think that it's important to understand that they're sovereign nation with their own goals, and they are naturally, I don't want to say distrustful, but hesitant to dive into any relationship with the government and some of the other partner groups that are working on these issues. But I think that they're an amazing partner, and it's great to see more of them around. Yeah.
I guess DeSantis, I think, just signed their agreement with them for $700 million.
Was that the gaming pact? Yeah, so so DeSantis signed the law that was passed by the legislature that's going to be taking money from the gaming, or money that is made through the gaming industry, and putting that towards conservation dollars. Some of that is going to go to buying land and locking it away for conservation. Some of it's going to be payments through FDACs to agriculture producers to limit the amount of nutrients, or to keep farming their land but not sell it to developers. So it's a big pot of money that can go a lot of places, but it is going towards conservation. So we're excited about that. Sorry. I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that. Sorry.
I saw a really great news piece yesterday where Sanibel was talking a lot about beyond the agricultural issue of big sugar, the role of urbanization and the nutrients coming from everybody that lives here in Southwest Florida, being supported by data. The data is out there. Sanibel-Captiva Conservation Foundation has done a huge study looking at samples over 20 years. So when we talk about that, and we talk about things like what happened with the fertilizer ordinance, that being taken away from local communities to deal with it, do you think that advocacy, if you could give us just some specific direction about how we can take what you're presenting and translate it into action on something like fertilizer ordinance, or where could we help?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the answer to that is twofold. So advocacy is majority of my job. My job is taking science that we produce and translating that into effective advocacy, which means a lot of different things depending on what we're advocating for, what the venue is, who we have on our side. I think that there's the main two things I would say about effective advocacy. First and foremost is it starts at home. It starts in your own backyard. I think you know better than most how important it is to pay attention to the decisions being made, pay attention to what SCCF is sending to your inbox, what our other partner groups are saying about issues, because there's so many decisions that are being made at the municipal level, at the county level, that once they snowball and get down the road, suddenly they're being talked about all over Florida. Suddenly they're national news. But if we could get in front of them at earlier stages, in the zoning hearing stage or even prior to that, and engage and let our leaders know that we want to protect the environment. We want to conserve lands. We want to have development done in a smart, forward-thinking way that's going to protect this state for my children and my children's children. And if we can do that and engage at those levels, it's generally a much smaller animal to have to tackle. That being said, there is a lot of impediments to doing that for a lot of us. A lot of these meetings happen on like Wednesday mornings when we all have other stuff to do. A lot of these notices are presented in intense legalese where you have to go through pages and pages of archaic language that's talking about weird zoning changes and height restrictions, and they go as far as they can to make sure that everything's very, very, very specific in a way that makes it very difficult to understand. And that's where advocacy support groups like SCCF, like Conservancy of Southwest Florida, like Calusa Waterkeeper can really come in, because we are watching this stuff. And when we flag something like that, suddenly know that it's something that we're paying attention to, and we think other people should be as well. I think another big point about advocacy and effective advocacy is really that when you're engaging in the public comment process, when you're getting up and voicing your concerns for a project or a permit or anything, it's really important to understand what a legal comment is. A lot of the time I'll get up and I'll see people give a fiery condemnation of a project and say how much they hate it and they don't like it and they don't want it here. And they brought all their neighbors, and all their neighbors get up and say the same thing. And that is the place that's most effective is at those lower levels, when you're sitting in front of one of your municipal leaders, one of your county leaders, someone you have a relationship with, someone that knows you or knows your community or knows that you aren't just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for a larger group of people who feel the same way and couldn't necessarily be there in the same manner that you can. When you're moving up to the state level or the federal level and you're submitting written comments, or you're sitting on a Zoom meeting waiting for your turn to speak, a lot of those that are dealing with the Administrative Procedures Act and the federal comment process will group everyone together who is saying they don't like the project in different words and count that as one comment. And so you can have an hour and a half of people all saying how much they dislike this plan, but unless there's new or novel information, that's only going to be counted as one type of comment. That's not to say you shouldn't engage in those processes. I think you absolutely should, but it's important to provide either factual information or legal standing or some novel information that can be taken in and put on the record in such a way that it's going to have an actual change. Yeah, so if you're raising an issue, generally you don't need legal standing to make a comment, but if you have a reasoning for why this action is going counter to a legal requirement somewhere, whether it's county, state, federal, anything that you may know about, if you think that there's endangered species on the property or could be on the property, then you should definitely bring that up. And it's ideally, you can cite the section of the Endangered Species Act that you're referring to. But even just saying there's endangered species here and working with other partners who have people who are engaged, if people are concerned about gopher tortoises being on a property and they come to me, then we can work together to figure out what the comments should be to reflect that. And so legal standing, yes, if you're engaging in lawsuits or surrounding an issue, if you're going to the hearing examiner to provide comments on the record for that and you need legal standing, that's generally when you can provide or prove that a harm is being done to you or will be done to you. And generally you prove that by either living in the area, owning a business, owning property in the area, or utilizing some sort of resource recreationally, whether it's for fishing, birding, hiking, kayaking, canoeing. And if any of that would be impacted, then courts have held that you have standing to respond to claims to that issue. Sign up for our email list, sign up for our social medias, sign the Right to Clean and Healthy Water petition, be informed, talk to your neighbors, don't irrigate your lawn.
Thank you. What a great summary. So thank you so much for sharing with us. You gave us a lot of things that we can do in the future, and we hope that we'll be working with you as well. So everyone here, make your voices heard, take some action, and thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to cut this off. I know there's a lot of interest, but it'll give us a chance to come back together and do some additional things. I want to just remind everyone, we will have one more event, educational event this year. That will be May 4th back here in this. It'll be on voting and preparing for the elections. And again, I want to thank you very much for this. So our members meeting, our annual meeting will be starting promptly at 11:15. For those of you on Zoom, I'd like to remind you, you have to do a separate Zoom link. And if you can't find that,